I want to start by being very clear that academic research that influences policy, that's accessible to policy, that's meaningful to policy, is not retail shopping. It means that academics don't go into their creative mode by themselves, design something beautiful, it's shiny, and then you produce it at the end, and the policymaker comes flipping through. You're making minor modifications. If it's Syria, I recommend the light blue. If it's Colombia, definitely the hot pink. Now, in fact, good and effective academic research that can access and interact with and influence policy is more like having your clothes made by a tailor. It's a multiple-step process. It's a process that involves a number of different people. And it has several things that have to happen, and they have to happen in particular orders, in particular ways, for you to actually have something that's fit for purpose. So through the support of the Carnegie Corporation, we've been at Fletcher really struggling with how do you bridge this academic policy gap. And we've come up with several insights based on the work that we've all been doing and then intensive thinking and engagement around this over the last 2 years. And this is several things. First, one of the things we find is that it's really a matter of relationships. The policymakers have relationships with particular researchers, and that those relationships are built on the trust and confidence in those researchers. It's exactly what Tanya was talking about. Now, if you broaden to an international team, you can broaden that network with policymakers. And that's exactly what we tried to do. So not only do you have your networks and the policymakers who trust you, you've got people all over the world that you can tap into. Because one of the things we find is that policymakers tend to go back time and again to the same trusted researchers. They can exert a lot of influence. Another thing that we've learned is that you absolutely have to have rigorous data. Comparable data, larger scale data, super important. In-depth data, but also metadata. Data that you as the research team are 100% ready to own. You're confident in it, and that the policymakers are also confident in what you've got. You also have to really know your policymakers. You have to know and suss out who they are, what are the right institutions to be working with for the kind of questions you're interested in, who are the right organizations, and then with that, within those organizations, who are the right people that can champion your work. And we've found that a good entry point is mid-level, people who are working at the mid-level. They have much more time than a higher-level policymaker. You can engage with them a lot back and forth, and they can help move things up that chain until you finally can get to higher policy level makers where you can make those key points. But this is all predicated on the fact that you have actually worked closely with the policymakers. We actually would think that you would think of them as actually part of the research team. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that more through an example. But the idea is that even from the beginning of your research questions, you're engaging them. And then you're going to engage them throughout the whole research process. This means that for academics, you have to get down out of your ivory tower. You have to say, I'm willing to think about some different questions. I'm willing to frame my question in a different way. I might be willing to work in countries that are their priorities to try to answer these questions, right? And finally, you really have to understand that the communication, how you communicate with them from the beginning through the end with your findings, and then in terms of implementation, it has to be very effective communication. This has come up time and again, that we're speaking different languages, that we're not putting it in formats that are accessible to policymakers. So presentations need to be concise and clear, and messaging has to be actionable. But it has to be actionable on your understanding of what that organization can actually do. What's their mandate? What's their interest? What's their resource look like, right? So I want to give an example of how this comes together through some of my own research. And that would be research that I've carried out now in a variety of forms for nearly 20 years on the issue of child soldiers. Now, in the mid to late 90s, when the phenomenon of child soldiers came on the world stage, and people were reacting rightly to the horror of what was happening with child soldiers around the world, the attention and the focus was on what was going on with boys. That it was boys we were mostly concerned about, that it was boys that we had to be pulling out, it was boys we had to be focusing on. And we asked the question, where are the girls? And when answering that question took us around the world, made us go back in time, and put us in the field in situations of active and current conflict. Now, the research issues that a number of us take on at Fletcher are research that I think ethically should not be undertaken for the sake of knowledge. I don't think, personally, anybody should be doing research on issues around child soldiering for the sake of producing knowledge and publishing articles and getting promotions on the backs of child soldiers. I think that kind of research and the research that a number of us do at the Fletcher School is about action research. It's about informing policy to try to make a change on some of the toughest issues that we're facing in our lives. So how do you do that? Well, just like what I was talking about, one of the things you've got to do is you've got to get the policymakers on board from the beginning. You've got to have an established reputation. So we had just come off, my colleagues and I, a large international study, comparative study on women in peace building, funded by the Canadian government. The Canadian government at this point was one of the leaders in the world on addressing issues of children affected by armed conflict. They were also one of the leaders on the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So that was a perfect nexus for me. Speaking of nexuses, it's a perfect nexus for me. So they had the platform, they had the governments behind it, they had a stake in it at the UN, and then we linked up with organizations who were the leading organizations around the world working on this issue. And we worked like a coalition. We were researchers in a coalition feeding information into that coalition, getting information back, refining questions, testing ideas. A number of people from these organizations sat on an advisory board for our study. So from the minute we kind of hit the ground, we had a large group that was already interested in what we were doing. And so what did we learn? Well, one of the things that our research found was that the use of girls as soldiers was much more widespread than anyone had thought. And our research really shifted some paradigms about this. So when people would talk about child soldiers, the time that we were doing this research, and unfortunately even now, you would hear these young people referred to as, including by heads of state, unfortunately, a lost generation, ticking time bombs, the next war in the waiting. So this was a population we were told we should be afraid of, is dangerous, has nothing to contribute, and we should put a lot of effort into trying to contain them or suppress them. What we found instead in working with child soldiers, both girls and boys, around the world, was young people who were absolutely resilient, who were surviving things that most of us in this room would be very hard-pressed to survive. That they were young people who, in some cases, looked into the cultures and countries that they were living in. They saw incredibly pervasive racism, ethnicized violence in politics, classism and caste-based systems, sexism. They saw societies and cultures, as they approached adulthood, really waiting to devour them, and they pushed back. We saw young people and we met young people who had basically no choices to enter into what they did in some cases. And their biggest accomplishment was that they survived and they were maybe able to keep some of their family and friends alive. So what we learned really turned things on its head. We also learned that we have to push open this idea of what is a child soldier. And this particularly mattered for girls. I want to give 2 concrete examples on how our research impacted policy. The first has to do with the Special Court for Sierra Leone. We did in-depth work there, and my colleagues and I were part of giving evidence for the team of prosecutors for the Special Court for Sierra Leone for the conviction for the first time in an international court of the crime of forced marriage. And this is against Shaun, one of the second in command of the rebel forces. This is the first time this crime had been articulated, and it was very much based on an understanding of the kind of research that we had carried out. And the second example is what's called the Paris Commitments or the Paris Principles. These are the principles and commitments on prevention of the recruitment of children, and then if they are recruited, the best practices on how to demobilize them and how to reintegrate them into society. When this was announced, 56 countries signed on, and the issues around girls are well incorporated into both of those. When it was announced, 56 countries signed on. There's now 105 signed on. So in conclusion, there are really 3 things I want you to remember about what I think is important for effective policy engagement by academics. And the first is you have to be patient. Yes, policy is moving very fast, but policy takes a long time to change at the same time. You're going to have to stay engaged. Tanya's saying she's getting exhausted. It's a marathon, not a sprint. That constant engagement, right, is needed. You have to be patient. Second thing, you've got to be committed to partnership. The broader your coalition, the more contacts and networks you have, the more you're in a space where you're feeding back to each other, the stronger your work's going to be. And the third is you absolutely must have a commitment, I believe, to work with policymakers. Because what policymakers can do is actually make the reality of your findings come to life. What your findings really mean through policy and program and implementation, that actually comes to life. So you would see working with them from the beginning to the absolute end is essential. Thank you.